By 1939, I was 23 years old and had taken a job on the New York City police force. I've never really examined until now just why I should have chosen that particular career. But I guess it came as a result of a number of things. Foremost among these was probably my grandfather. Even though I resented the old man for the amount of guilt and pressure and recrimination he'd subjected my dad to, I suppose that the simple fact of spending the first 12 years of my life living in my grandfather's proximity had indelibly stamped a certain set of moral values and conditions upon me. I was never so extreme in my beliefs concerning God, the family, and the flag as my father's father was. But if I look at myself today, I can see basic notions of decency that were passed down direct from him to me. His name was Hollis Mason. And perhaps because my parents had flattered the old man by naming me after him, he always took a special concern over my upbringing and moral instruction. One of the things that he took great pains to impress upon me was that country folk were morally healthier than city folk, and that cities were just cesspools into which all the world's dishonesty and greed and lust and godlessness drained and was left to fester unhindered. Obviously, as I got older and came to realize just how much drunkenness and domestic violence and child abuse was hidden behind the neighborly facade of some of these lonely Montana farmhouses, I understood that my grandfather's appraisal had been a little one-sided. Nevertheless, some of the things that I saw in the city during my first few years here filled me with a sort of ethical revulsion that I couldn't shake off. To some degree, I still can't. The pimps, the pornographers, the protection artists, the landlords who set dogs on their elderly tenants when they wanted them out to make way for more lucrative custom. The old men who touched little children, and the callous young rapists who were barely old enough to shave. I saw these people all around me, and I'd feel sick in my gut at the world and what it was becoming. Worse, there were times when I'd upset my dad and mom by loudly wishing I was back in Montana. Despite everything, I wished no such thing. But sometimes, I'd be mad at them, and it seemed like the best way to hurt them, to reawaken all those old doubts and worries and sleeping dogs of guilt. I'm sorry I did it now, and I wish I could have told them that while they were alive. I wish I could have told them that they were right in bringing me to the city, and they did the right thing by me. I wish I could have let them know that. Their lives would have been so much easier. When the gap between the world of the city and the world my grandfather had presented to me as right and good became too wide and depressing to tolerate, I turned to my other great love, which was pulp adventure fiction. Despite the fact that Hollis Mason Sr. would have had nothing but scorn and loathing for all those violent and garish magazines, there was a sort of prevailing morality in them that I'm sure he would have responded to. The world of Doc Savage and the Shadow was one of absolute values, where what was good was never in the slightest doubt, and where what was evil inevitably suffered some fitting punishment. The notion of good and justice espoused by Lamont Cranston with his slouch hat and blazing automatics seemed a long way from that of the fierce and taciturn old man I remember sitting up alone into the Montana night with, no company, save his Bible. But I can't help feeling that if the two had ever met, they'd have found something to talk about. For my part, all those brilliant and resourceful sleuths and heroes offered a glimpse of a perfect world where morality worked the way it was meant to. Nobody in Doc Savage's world ever killed themselves, except thwarted kamikaze assassins or enemy spies with cyanide capsules. Which world would you rather live in if you had the choice? Answering that question, I suppose, was what led me to become a cop. It was also what led me to later become something more than a cop. Bear that in mind, and I think the rest of the narrative will be easier to swallow. I know people always have trouble understanding just what brings a person to behave the way that I and people like me behave. What makes us do the sort of things we do. I can't answer for anybody else, and I suspect that all our answers would be different anyway. But in my case, it's fairly straightforward. I like the idea of adventure, and I feel bad unless I'm doing good. I've heard all the psychologist theories, I've heard all the jokes and the rumors and innuendo. But what it comes down to for me is that I dressed up like an owl and I fought crime because it was fun and because it needed doing and because I goddamn felt like it. Okay, there it is. I've said it. I dressed up as an owl and fought crime. For me, it all started in 1938, the year when they invented the superhero. I was too old for comic books when the first issue of Action Comics came out, or at least too old to read them in public without souring my promotion chances. But I noticed a lot of the little kids on my beat reading it, and I couldn't resist asking one of them if I could glance through it. I figured if anybody saw me, I could put it all down to keeping a good relationship with the youth of the community. There was a lot of stuff in that first issue. There were detective yarns and stories about magicians whose names I can't remember, but from the moment I set eyes on it, I only had eyes for the Superman story. Here was something that presented the basic morality of the pulps without all of their darkness and ambiguity. The atmosphere of the horrific and faintly sinister that hung around the shadow was nowhere to be seen in the bright primary colors of Superman's world. And there was no hint of the repressed sex urge, which had sometimes been apparent in the pulps. So I had discomfort and embarrassment. I'd never been entirely sure what Lamont Cranston was up to with Margot Lane, but I'd bet it was nowhere near as innocent and wholesome as Clark Kent's relationship with her namesake, Lois. Of course, all of these old characters are gone and forgotten now, but I'm willing to bet that there was at least a few older readers out there who will remember enough to know what I'm talking about. Anyway, suffice it to say that I read that story through about 8 times before giving it back to the complaining kid that I'd snitched it from. It set off a lot of things I'd forgotten about deep inside me, and kicked all those old fantasies that I'd had when I was 13 or 14 back into gear. The prettiest girl in the class would be attacked by bullies, and I'd be there to beat them off. But when she offered to kiss me as a reward, I'd refuse. Gangsters would kidnap my math teacher, Miss Albertine, and I'd track them down and kill them one by one until she was free. And then she'd break off her engagement with my sarcastic English teacher, Mr. Richardson, because she'd fallen hopelessly in love with her grim-faced and silent 14-year-old savior. All this stuff came flooding back as I stood there, gawking at the hijacked comic book. And even though I laughed at myself for having entertained such transparent juvenile fantasies, I didn't laugh as hard as I might have done. Anyway, although I'd occasionally managed to trick some unsuspecting tyke into lending me his most recent issue of the funny book in question, and then spend the rest of the day leaping tall buildings inside my head, my fantasies were to remain as fantasies. until I opened a newspaper in the autumn of that same year and found that superheroes had escaped from their four-colored world and invaded the plain, factual, black and white of the headlines. The first news story was simple and unpresupposing enough, but it shared enough elements with those fictions that were closest to my heart to make me notice it and file it in my memory for future reference. It concerned an attempted assault and robbery that had taken place in Queens, New York. A man and his girlfriend, walking home after a night at the theater, had been set upon by a gang of 3 men armed with guns. After relieving the couple of their valuables, the gang had started to beat and physically abuse the young man while threatening to indecently assault his girlfriend. At this point, the crime had been interrupted by a figure who dropped into the alleyway from above with something over his face and proceeded to disarm the 3 attackers before beating them with such severity that all 3 required hospital treatment, and that one subsequently lost the use of both legs as a result of a spinal injury. The witnesses' recounting of the event was confused and contradictory, but there was still something in the story that gave me a tingle of recognition. And then, a week later, it happened again. Reportage on this second instance was more detailed. A supermarket stick-up had been prevented thanks to the intervention of a tall man built like a wrestler who wore a black hood and cape and also wore a noose around his neck. This extraordinary being had crashed in through the window of the supermarket while the robbery was in progress and attacked the man responsible with such intensity and savagery that those not disabled immediately were only too willing to drop their guns and surrender. Connecting this incident of massed intervention with its predecessor, the papers ran the story under a headline that read simply, "Hooded Justice." The first masked avenger outside comic books had been given his name. Reading and rereading that news item, I knew that I had to be the second. I'd found my vocation.
Takes a Roxanne gravel, baby, make a solid road, make a solid road.